Mesdames, Messieurs, je vous remercie.
Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to thank you for coming to this sixth press conference held since the beginning of my term in the presence of the Prime Minister and the members of the government. This time, we have images, we have events and situations that are striking at our very consciences. First of all, the heroism shown by the passengers on a train from Amsterdam to Paris, who pinned down a terrorist who was ready to commit the worst, and the heritage of humanity destroyed in Palmyra. Thousands of refugees on the way to Europe and on European roads. A lifeless child washed on a Turkish shore, a martyr, the symbol of 3,000 who have perished in the Mediterranean waters since the beginning of the year. So, faced with what obviously gives rise to emotion and to compassion and to concern, it is up to us, it is up to me, to respond to this emergency and to make choices. Those who understand that this is a time where we have to take into account what is happening and also where we wish to go in the future. And so the very first choice is coping with the influx of refugees, of displaced persons, with humanity and responsibility. Since the beginning of the year, 350,000 people have crossed the Mediterranean in order to come to Europe. That is very many. That is 3 times more than last year. So this is a crisis. It is a dramatic crisis. It is serious. It can be brought under control, and it will be. It is France's duty to offer asylum. The right to asylum is part and parcel of the French soul, of the French flesh. It's a matter of history. This is the reason why we have this responsibility. A history that has been marked by generations of refugees who have come to France over the past decades in order to build the country together. It is also a basic principle in our Constitution. It is actually enshrined in the preamble to the French Constitution. Any person who is persecuted because of his action in favor of liberty has the right to seek asylum on the territory of the Republic. This principle was even included in the Constitution when it came to knowing whether Schengen was compatible with our laws. And this principle is also recalled in the rules of the European Union. And this is why, faced with this tragedy, with this critical situation, I have proposed together with Angela Merkel a mechanism, a standing, binding mechanism to let refugees into our countries and distribute this effort among all of the European countries. The operative word here is binding, compulsory. This is what sets it apart from what was done or not done over the past few months. And France is ready to assume its share. The European Commission is proposing, or shall soon propose, that 120,000 refugees be distributed, resettled over the next 2 years. For France, this will mean 24,000 persons. And we shall do so. We will, because this is the very principle to which I believe that France is committed. We will do it because this is a proposal that we ourselves put forward and that we want to see adopted by all Europeans. Many mayors, many communities, many associations, many churches, And private individuals are already providing such shelter to asylum seekers. I welcome this. It's got to be organized in a serious and dignified manner. And in order to do that, the Minister of the Interior will be meeting with all mayors concerned next Saturday, and the Prime Minister will have to implement all of the policies in order to make sure that this choice materializes. France, therefore, has a duty, but the response is a European response. It's an overall response. And in order for Europe to act effectively, we need border controls in Italy, in Greece, in Hungary, with identification and registration centers in order to welcome, but also to make a distinction between those who are actually seeking asylum and have a claim to asylum, and those who would have to be returned to the border. This is the one condition that must be met for the external borders of Europe to be protected. It is also to be sure that we welcome the refugees humanely. But let us look at the reality the way it is. There are 4 million in camps in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and hundreds of thousands in the Horn of Africa. And if we wish to avoid a veritable exodus of these populations, we must give massive humanitarian assistance to countries, to associations, to the High Commissioner for Refugees, to make sure that these people remain as close as possible to the countries that they're fleeing from. We must also work with the countries of origin and the countries of transit in order to set up centers that may welcome those who are fleeing for other reasons, for instance, economic reasons, and to work out a true co-development policy. And this is going to be the subject of the La Valette summit on the 11th of December. Next, France will be putting forward proposals along these lines. But that is not enough. We have to raise even higher the level of responsibility. We must know that the question of refugees and displaced persons is a question that affects all of the countries in the south and not, as some people believe, the countries of the north. This question of the displaced persons and refugees affects Africa, the Middle East, because of wars and crises, and it also affects other continents, including Asia. So we'll be putting forward a proposal for the holding of an international conference on the subject of refugees, and we're ready to host that conference in Paris. But let me go back to what Europe needs to do. France and Germany, for a few weeks already, with the ministers of the Interior and the Foreign Affairs, have been preparing this overall plan. Which will be submitted to the Council of Ministers of the Interior on September the 14th. And I would like for these guidelines, though they have not been adhered to by all countries, we're talking here about simple but effective rules. If this doesn't happen, then the Council of Europe will have to look, the Council will have to look into this. On these proposals, on this subject, the government will be organizing a parliamentary debate in the days to come. But then, at the same time, we know the reasons for these misfortunes, for this tragedy, to which we wish to respond through honor and action. The root cause is war. So, at one and the same time, we must fight terrorism in France and in the various areas where they spring from. In France, the national alert system has been taken to the highest level. The law and intelligence has been accepted, has been promulgated. More security on transport, more fight against indoctrination. But here again, security has to be strengthened because there are terrorist attempts that are thwarted, that are aborted, that are foiled, and they will continue as long as hatred feeds this terrorism. This terrorism finds its origin, its raison d'être in these crises. The worst example is Daesh. It is Daesh which, through the massacres it commits, is responsible for so many families, so many thousands of families fleeing. And it's been extending its grip over the Middle East for the past 2 years. And it is from there that many attacks are organized against many countries, including our own. So my responsibility is to make sure that we can be as informed as possible about the threats against our country, the better to cope with them. And this is the reason why I've asked the Minister of Defense, already starting tomorrow, to carry out reconnaissance flights over Syria, so as to be able to envisage the possibility of striking Daesh, whilst at the same time preserving our independence of action and decision. The Parliament will be informed of this operation under Article 35 of the Constitution. So making choices is also what the world will have to do. Next December, in order to reach an agreement on the climate, I think that we all more or less agree today. Good intentions have been expressed, declarations have been made, but we still need a binding agreement on a level with the challenge ahead of us. We've got 3 months before this conference. France has committed itself to it, and France wishes to accelerate things as possible, as quickly as possible. With Laurent Fabius, we want to make sure that the next General Assembly of the United Nations will pave the way to this worldwide climate conference which will be hosted in Paris. Here again, we need to show the way to lead the world. But France, in order to be able to lead, to influence, to convince, and to be able to act in all realms of international existence, has to be strong. It has to be a morally strong France. This was the case on the 11th of January, when millions of French men and women went to the streets, took to the streets in order to show their attachment to liberty, to freedom. It's the same message that France has to put forward today. France's mission is not to crawl into itself or to seek refuge behind a Maginot Line that has never defended anybody. The honor of France cannot be to give up on its values, on its core values. It is not leaving the euro, ending Schengen, dropping the common agricultural policy that would make it possible for us to again be prosperous and strong and a sovereign country. Because that would be tantamount to regression and to decline. It is only by being itself that France will succeed, on condition that it is bold enough to make choices, to assume these choices, and to make sure that they are accepted by others. France must be strong economically and socially, first of all, in order to bring unemployment down. And this is the meaning of the decisions that have been taken for the past 3 years, reforms that have been undertaken, and the new reforms that will be undertaken until the very end of my term of office. The Pact of Responsibility with lower income, social contributions, or insurance contributions from companies will be continued, and obviously discussions are going on with the social partners. I believe that that stability and respect of our commitments is essential in order to build confidence. This applies to us and also to companies. And the policy to reduce taxes, which was commenced in 2014 and strengthened this year, will be continued up until 2016. More than $2 billion will be devoted to this, and 8 million households will be concerned. But that's not the end of the line. There is the law on activity and growth, and I've asked the Minister of the Economy to prepare a law on the economic opportunities created by innovation in the digital world, but not only, which may be a risk, and therefore we have to see to it that things are done well, but may also provide a fantastic opportunity to many economic sectors. The social partners must look into these subjects. The social conference will also pursue the objective of organizing the rights of wage earners and employees throughout their professional life, and this is what is at stake in this major reform of the personal activity account. Reforming means also that the labor code has to become readable, accessible, because that is what protects employment and makes it possible to create employment. Therefore, we must give pride of place to collective bargaining, to the participation of companies in these negotiations so as to better adapt the labor code to the realities in companies. There's a report that will be submitted on the 9th of September to the Prime Minister on this, and then will be subject to consultation, and a bill will be put forward. There are many other challenges ahead of us. I won't mention them all: in agriculture, in health, aging, the digital industry, and the freedoms that have to be preserved, justice, which must continue being modernized and boosted. So we need to make these choices. Make choices in order to respond to emergencies every single time it is necessary. Make choices in order to pave the way to the future. Make choices in order to protect the French. Make choices in order to be able to have this country move forward, to be successful. We need, therefore, also, as the people responsible for France, make choices in Europe whenever Europe requires that, but also make choices for the world, because the world, sooner or later, comes into our own circle. If we do not control things. And choices is what I have been making with Manuel Valls as head of government, and which I will continue making until the very end of my term. And I suggest that we now move to questions. Morning, Mr. President. I should like for you to spell out and to explain what you have just said about Syria, sir. Is France going to commit itself militarily to Syria, as it has been doing for a year now in Iraq? Over and beyond the reconnaissance flights that you have mentioned, will there be strikes against Daesh centers in Syria? And are you excluding deployment of troops on the ground, as some have been clamoring for, who say that only by having boots on the ground that it would be possible to overcome that crisis decisively? Well, France, faced with terrorism, has always assumed its responsibilities. We did this when the time came to intervene in Mali. We also showed this in the Sahel, including our fight against a terrorist movement, Boko Haram, which unfortunately is still affecting many countries in the region and still affecting, obviously, the civil population. We have also shown this under other circumstances, to avoid a bloodbath in the Central African Republic, even though this was not connected with terrorism, but it was also our duty. And also, when it came to envisaging the possibility of strikes in Syria, because there had been use of chemical weapons, France was ready. And where Iraq is concerned, when the time came to build a coalition to make sure that the Iraqis could regain their sovereignty, we did that, and we're part and parcel of that coalition. Today, in Syria, what we want to know, what we want to be able to do is, first of all, have complete knowledge of what is being prepared against us and against the civilian population. This is why I have decided that already starting tomorrow, there should be reconnaissance flights in connection, obviously, with the coalition, within the framework of the coalition, because that is the one condition to be met in order for us to have the possibility of intervening in that particular way. And then afterwards, depending on the information that we will collect, the intelligence that we'll be able to gather, and the reconnaissance that shall have been made, we will be ready. We will be ready for strikes. Some tell us, because they want to move quickly, that we already have to deploy troops on the ground in Syria. Even those who were hostile under different conditions to any form of intervention of any nature. But let's set that aside. The issue is there. And I believe it would be unrealistic to send French troops to Syria, to deploy French troops on the ground. Unrealistic, because we would be alone. And it would also be inconsequential. Inconsequential, because that would be transforming this operation into an occupation force. So we do not want any deployment of troops on the ground, not anymore in any case than what we do in Iraq. It's not a matter of principle. We're not against interventions. As a matter of principle, we did that in Mali, but in Iraq, it's up to the Iraqis to carry out those ground operations, and in Syria, it's up to the Syrian rebels. It's up to the national forces involved to assume that responsibility. However, France is making sure that political solutions are found, because ultimately the solution will be political in Syria. So we believe that we have to be able to talk with all countries that could facilitate that solution and that transition. I'm thinking here of the Gulf countries. I'm also thinking of Russia, of Iran, and many other countries that are already part and parcel of the coalition. On the issue of transition, let me say that this is an essential point to us. And this is really what justifies our reservation vis-à-vis a kind of action that would not be totally controlled in Syria. There's nothing that should be done in order to bolster or to shore up Bashar al-Assad. The departure of Bashar al-Assad at one point in time will have to occur. And this is what we must be working towards, so as to be able to get a true gathering of Syrians on a democratic basis to find a future for this martyred country. Mr. President, I'm from France 2. France will therefore welcoming 24,000 refugees over the next 2 years, as you said. Over and beyond these initiatives you've mentioned, do you think that the French population as a whole is actually ready to make that effort to welcome all these men and women? According to a public opinion poll over the weekend, 55% of the people polled were unfavorable to such welcome. And what do you have to say about the argument of Viktor Orban, the Hungarian president, i.e. welcoming more refugees is actually a magnet for ever greater arrivals? You said 250,000 or 120,000 of the next two years, but don't you think in the end it will be many more than 120,000? Well, first of all, you're talking about the reaction of the French people. The French people are a great people. A people that has been forged over generations and generations of men and women who very often came from distant places. France is a people that has always been capable in its history, whenever essential things were at stake, to welcome those who were being persecuted and who were being displaced. And France has this honor to uphold, faced with the horror of what is going on. Also, we need to reassure the French people also. As we find the answers to this movement that has become amplified with these images that have struck the minds of peoples all around the world. So the French people do have legitimate causes for concern, which we need to allay. It is not just a matter of welcoming people in any old way. First of all, because this would not be a dignified way of doing things, and it wouldn't be possible. What I have proposed with Angela Merkel is to, first of all, to make sure that those who have already arrived, those who are already here, and who can claim asylum, and only for those legitimate asylum seekers, that there should be this distribution mechanism. And then we need to have these registration centers that should make it possible to exercise control on the borders. So that we can make a distinction between asylum seekers and other people who come to these centers and who pursue different objectives and whom we will not be able to welcome. At these centers, there will be identification and registration of those who are real refugees who can put in a claim for asylum and who are to be distributed among all European countries according to the criteria that have been outlined. And then there will be a return to the borders for the others. And it is because we have this capacity, or because we will have this capacity, that we will be able to make a distinction. And we will be able also to assume our duty and not to grant rights to those who have no claim for them. This is how we will bring the situation in control. And then there is what happens on the other side of the Mediterranean, because if we do not make sure that there are centers, there are already very many of them, there are refugee camps already that could welcome and house these populations as close as possible to their countries of origin. If that is not done, then we would be facing not just a crisis of displaced people, but a gigantic humanitarian crisis, because we wouldn't be talking about thousands of people, but hundreds of thousands of people. This is the reason we are undertaking this commitment. We must undertake it vis-à-vis those countries that are already welcoming and housing these refugees. And I'm thinking in particular of the countries of transit that must also be helped in order to keep these people there, and this will be also our policy with the African countries.
Do you really believe that for such an issue, and that's true for other issues as well, that opinion polls should determine our choices? In fact, these opinion polls are contradictory. Opinion polls are carried out every day with questions that are often biased and lead to obvious answers. No. There are times, in particular when you're the President of France, where you need to take decisions according to the country's major interests in terms of what we represent, in terms of an idea of France, as well as people's rights. This is for us not only a matter of emotion, but also of responsibility. That's what leads me to take decisions along with the government. Then you have countries that would like to have ethnical criteria, that would like to welcome some refugees and not others, according to their religion. There are countries that would like to build walls and not take a single refugee. But what would have these countries thought 30 years ago? If, when the Berlin Wall came down, we had said no, not at once, not like that. Don't come. Take your time. Remain where you are. No, we said, come. You are Europeans. You're going to build the union we want to build with us. We are within the same entity, with the same principles and human rights. That's the kind of words that need to be said. President, I'm from the AFP. I'm absolutely certain that my colleagues will talk about Syria again, but there's another issue you haven't mentioned until now, that you have talked about it with Chancellor Merkel, and you've played a crucial role. Of course, I'm referring to Ukraine. The Ukrainian President, Poroshenko, has just said for the first time that the ceasefire was at last being complied with in Ukraine. In your opinion, is this an opportunity at last to meet President Putin with the Ukrainian President and the German Chancellor to ensure a lasting ceasefire in that country? In Minsk, in January, the four of us, the Ukrainian President, the Russian President, Mrs. Merkel, and myself, drew up what we call the Minsk Agreement. There have been delays, more people have died, but the process has moved forward. There has been progress in the last few weeks. First, because the ceasefire has been more or less complied with, although some people are still dying, because heavy weapons have been withdrawn. To a further extent, there's been progress because the Kiev Parliament voted a constitutional law. You saw under which conditions, with extreme right groups protesting outside Parliament. And then there are elections being talked about for the end of the year. Now, with the Chancellor and President Poroshenko, we met again in late August, and then we had a conversation with President Putin on the phone. I mean, the Chancellor and myself, and the foreign ministers will now be talking to one another in the next few days. And I would like to see a Normandy-like agreement can be held in Paris before the General Assembly of the United Nations to enable us to assess the process, see what stage we've reached, and lead it to its end. Because, as you know, the Minsk agreements were to cover the period until the end of the year. Therefore, we'll have to ensure that commitments are complied with respect to general election, the autonomy law, to decentralize the eastern Ukrainian regions. And if this process is successful, well then, I will call for sanctions to be lifted, because that was the prerequisite that had been set. President, for France 3, the TV channel, criticism is heard from time to time with respect to refugees, that France was slow to align itself on Angela Merkel's standpoint, in particular with respect to quotas, a word you pronounced for the first time this morning. Why have you changed your stance? Is that because of domestic policy reasons? Well, France is not in the same situation as Germany. That's a fact. Germany, I don't know if the figures will be confirmed, but Germany believes it will welcome 800,000 people, all in all, since the beginning of the year. In France, if I look only at political asylum right, i.e. people who are entitled to make such a request, the figure has remained virtually flat. Given what has just occurred, we believe that we'll have only 60,000 people applying for political asylum in 2015. France could therefore deem that it is concerned and not do anything, but that would be a sheer illusion. How can you imagine that people will not move towards Europe? Of course, some people do come to France and often want to go on to the United Kingdom. That's a whole problem at Calais. Why have I refused the word quota when it was first used? Because that creates an ambiguity. An ambiguity that suggested that once the quotas had been handed out, if I dare say so, there would be nothing more to be done. But the right to political asylum is a fundamental right. So we would have said, beyond a given number, you cannot come and apply for protection. That's not France. And in fact, this is the mechanism we have proposed, i.e. sharing out displaced people. The only change that has occurred is that word compulsory, as I insisted earlier. Because in June at the European Council, we had to share out at that time 40,000 people, 40,000. The European Council with 28 members, we spent most of the night, I'm quite used to that, in these meetings, and the entire debate focused on the concept of voluntary action. Countries said, we're quite willing to do something, but as long as we can choose what we want to do. So out of the 40,000 displaced people who had been proposed, who had already been identified, and therefore had to be relocated, 35,000 only got an answer. France did what it had to do. But that's not good enough, obviously. There are more refugees now, and that voluntary system is obviously not providing the expected outcome. So this will have to be a permanent and compulsory mechanism. Permanent, I mean, over several years. And if it is to be efficient, and if to ensure that countries are reassured, we need to be able to remain in control of this process, and that's what we're proposing with these enrollment centres and the policies to be carried out in the sites where the refugees are currently. France, with other European countries, but France in particular, has carried out crucial work, i.e. sending ships into the Mediterranean to save people who, alas, might lose their lives there. In fact, today, another French boat, has moved into the Mediterranean to carry out that work. So, as you can see, what leads me to take this decision with the Chancellor is the principle of solidarity, including with the Chancellor, who in fact let me know that respect to the refugees who'd come in from Hungary and are pouring into Germany today. I told the Chancellor that I was willing, with France, to welcome several hundred, up to 1,000 of them, because I believe we can't leave Germany alone to shoulder this responsibility. And these displaced people will come to France in the next few weeks. So there's what we can do on a voluntary basis, but it's also what needs to be done on a compulsory basis. And that's why it's a new mechanism that now needs to be adopted by European countries with an overall policy. And if there is no overall policy, this mechanism will blow up. And then we'll have a huge amount of displaced people pouring in, and probably the end of Schengen. And we'll go back to national borders. Do people believe that national borders will provide a solution? No, we need Europe, and Europe needs solidarity and responsibility, i.e. organisation. Europe is not just a space. Europe is policies. Europe is resources. Europe is also border guards who need to be there. That's what Europe is. Good day, President. I'm from Reuters. With respect to Syria, I'd like to know what you mean when you say neutralise Bashar al-Assad. That's a word you've used in the past. Does he have to leave immediately? Bashar al-Assad, do I need to remind you, is the one who's responsible for the current situation in Syria. Because when there were demonstrations, got his law enforcement troops to fire on his own people. He's shelled civilian populations. He's used chemical weapons. He's refused any debate with his opponents when they weren't locked up or killed. So for the last 3 years, this issue of Bashar al-Assad and what he can do political transition process has remained open. And we've always said Bashar al-Assad cannot remain at the head of Syria. So political transition means that eventually Bashar al-Assad will have to leave. And we need to have a very broad coalition government, of course, without terrorist groups. And that's a conviction we want to share with other countries, such as Russia and Iran. The Iranians, after the agreement on nuclear process, are back in the diplomatic game. When I talk about Putin, when I talk with Putin, I'm not talking only about Ukraine, but also Syria. That was the spirit of Geneva. 2 conferences were held. And now it's even more urgent. We need to find a solution, and Bashar al-Assad will not be part of it. And when I hear some people saying he's the least worst solution, when they don't say he's the best, some people are always in favor of dictators, and that should get their supporters to think about them, and that holds for our country too. When they say we can get along with Bashar al-Assad, but how do you want a Syrian family opponent who's sometimes seen his entire family slaughtered accept to have a conversation with Bashar al-Assad? We'll need to talk with the Syrian government, but eventually Bashar al-Assad will have to leave.
Bertrand Galichet, France Inter. Monsieur
le Président, vous avez annoncé tout à l'heure, et c'est une décision évidemment lourde, la France a dû s'engager d'abord dans des vols de reconnaissance en Syrie, puis over Syria, and in all likelihood start bombing
quelle est la perspective
objectives in Syria?
À quelle échéance peut-on imaginer que la France ou que vous aurez décidé que cette opération militaire aura atteint son but?
Will have reached its objectives.
The
resources that are going to be deployed in Syria, taken from those that are already being used in Iraq. And until now, you used to say, and that was a reason why France was not intervening in military purposes in Syria, that would have objectively helped Bashar al-Assad. Does this argument no longer hold because of the pressure of recent events or for any other reason? Thank you. Reconnaissance flights to gather information, because we want to know where the training centres are, the decision-making centres are, what is exact. What are the exact sites in Syria we're interested in? At the same time, we certainly cannot hope to help Bashar al-Assad. In most of Syria, his government is no longer effective. We're going to check that. We also are thinking about the civilian population that must not become the victim of our decisions. So for all these reasons, these reconnaissance flights will be carried out, and subsequently I will talk with the government and the military authorities in order to take decisions. Respect to the resources we're going to use. These are the resources allocated to the Shamal mission in Iraq, and that will be good enough for the reconnaissance flights and even subsequent actions. Respect to the budget, if you're worried about that. This will not require additional funds. Shall I remind you that 200 strikes have been carried out by our planes in Iraq? President, the Russians have announced they were building up their presence in Syria to boost the Syrian regime and to fight against Daesh, just like you. So the coalition going to fight Russia and Syria. And there's another question with respect to Lebanon. Lebanon is on the brink of disaster with more than 1 million refugees and a terrible political crisis. During the summer, you had said that you might go to Lebanon. Is there any additional information you can give us? And what can you do for Lebanon with the Iranians?
Sur la Syrie,
With respect to Syria,
la Russie est
once again,
un allié du régime.
Russia is an ally of the
Ça ne veut
current
pas dire
regime.
que la Russie soit un
This
soutien
does not mean
indéfectible à
that
Bachar.
Russia will never drop
Nous aurons
Bashar
là-dessus des
al-Assad.
discussions.
We will talk about that.
Ce que veut la Russie, c'est trouver
What
aussi.
Russia wants, too, is to find a solution.
Ensuite, sur le Liban,
With respect to Lebanon,
les conséquences de ce
the
qui se produit en
consequences of what's
Syrie
occurring in Syria
sont majeures. Plus d'1 million de personnes.
tremendous, more than 1 million displaced people.
Aujourd'hui, un résident au
We
Liban
believe that
sur
one
3 qui est un réfugié
resident
ou un déplacé.
out of 3 in Lebanon is a displaced
Donc, ce
person or
pays
refugee.
vit aussi une crise
So
politique.
Lebanon is
Le
also
président de la République n'a pas
racked
été
by a
encore
political crisis. The
élu.
president of Lebanon has not
Le
yet been
Parlement
elected.
a des difficultés pour
Parliament
tenir
is struggling
ces sessions.
to
Donc nous
meet.
devons être aux côtés des Libanais.
So we need to
Et c'est aussi
be
la
on the
raison
side
pour
of the
laquelle il y
Lebanese, and
aura,
that's also a reason why
lors de l'Assemblée générale des Nations
during the
Unies,
United Nations General
une
Assembly,
conférence internationale pour
there
le
will be an
soutien.
international conference to
Pour ce qui me
support
concerne,
Lebanon.
après cette
As far as I'm
conférence,
concerned, after that
et
conference,
dans les conditions qui permettront de rendre
and
ce
under the
déplacement
conditions
possible,
that will make such a trip
au
useful,
Liban,
I will
à la
go
fois
to
pour,
Lebanon,
aller dans un camp de réfugiés,
both to visit a
voir
refugee
où sont
camp,
les réfugiés, pour que nous puissions
see where the
justement
refugees
aider
are,
à ce qu'ils puissent y
to
rester,
ensure we
tout
can
près
help them remain
du
there,
lieu où ils vivaient il y a
close
quelques mois,
to where they
et
used to live
également
until a few
rencontrer
months
l'ensemble
ago,
des
and
autorités
also to meet all the political authorities in Lebanon.
Bonjour, William Horvin, Wall
Good
Street
morning.
Journal. Une question par rapport à l'Union européenne et le
Question with respect to the
Royaume-Uni.
European Union and the
Selon un
UK,
sondage ce week-end,
according to an opinion poll
une
carried
majorité
out
de
this weekend,
Britanniques voteraient pour
a majority
sortir
of
de l'Union européenne.
British
Est-ce que la
people
France
would
est
vote in
prête à
favour of
négocier
pulling out
avec,
from the European
le
Union?
gouvernement britannique?
Is France
Est-ce
ready
que
to negotiate with the British government?
Les Britanniques devraient rester à tout prix?
Do you believe
dans
that
l'Union
the
européenne?
UK should remain at all
Et
costs
quel est
within the
l'impact
European
de la
Union?
crise migratoire
And what is the
sur ces
impact
négociations?
of the refugee crisis on these
et donc aussi
negotiations?
des sondages au Royaume-Uni.
So you also have opinion polls
ils
in the
vont
United
varier.
Kingdom, but they'll
Forcément, d'ailleurs,
fluctuate.
Ils ont déjà changé en quelques semaines.
They've already changed in a few weeks.
Ce qui compte, c'est là encore
What matters here
les
too
positions politiques.
is the
Les choix
political
qui doivent être
standpoint.
faits. La France
Choices
souhaite
that need to be made. France
que le
would
Royaume-Uni
like
reste dans l'Union
the
européenne.
United Kingdom to remain
D'ailleurs,
within the
comment
European Union.
Comprendre
And in
que
fact, how could you
ce pays
understand
ami, ce
that
pays
this
qui fut notre allié,
friendly country
ce
that
pays
was our
qui
ally,
joue un rôle
that
sur
plays
le plan
a major role
international, puisse être
on the
hors
international
de
scene,
l'Union européenne. Ce ne serait
might
d'ailleurs
pull
pas son
out from the
intérêt.
European Union.
plan
In
économique.
fact, that would not be its interest,
Quand on sait
in its interest
combien
from an economic
un certain
viewpoint,
nombre de services financiers
since
vivent
you
de l'Union
know
européenne.
that many financial
Le
services
Premier ministre Cameron
live from
souhaite
the
qu'il y
European
ait une
Union.
discussion.
Prime Minister
Je vais d'ailleurs
Cameron
me
would like to
rendre
have a
à
conversation.
la fin du mois de septembre
I
au
will go
Royaume-Uni,
to the UK in late
pour,
September
échanger,
to
et
talk
je lui
with him,
préciserai exactement ce que je
and
vais vous
I'll
dire.
specify
C'est-à-dire que
to him exactly what I'm going to tell you now.
on peut discuter
We can
sur
always talk
ce que doit faire l'Europe,
about what
ce qu'elle ne
Europe
doit pas
needs to
faire,
do, what it must not
c'est-à-dire
do,
simplifier un certain nombre de ses décisions.
simplify
Oui,
some
très
of
bien.
its decisions.
On
Yes,
peut
fine.
également souhaiter qu'il y ait des
We
pays
can
qui soient dans la zone
also
euro
be
et
in
d'autres
favour
qui n'y
of
soient
having
pas,
sub-countries
sans
within
que
the
les
Eurozone
uns et les
and
autres ne
others
se
not,
gênent. Très bien.
without that leading to any
On peut
interference. Fine.
faire en sorte que les parlements
We
nationaux aient
can
davantage de
ensure
rôle.
that
Nous ne
national
sommes pas du
parliaments
tout,
have a greater
hostiles.
role to
En
play.
revanche,
We're not at all opposed to
si
that idea.
la discussion porte sur
Conversely,
les principes essentiels
If the
de l'Union
conversation
européenne, la libre circulation,
concerns the crucial
la capacité de
principles of the
décider
European
ensemble,
Union, freedom of
alors
movement,
là, nous ne voulons pas de
capacity to
modification des
decide
traités.
together, we rule out
Pour,
any change in the
ensuite,
treaties.
Ce qui concerne
Next, with
la
respect
question des
to
réfugiés,
refugees,
c'est vrai que le Royaume-Uni n'est pas dans la zone Schengen.
admittedly, the
Donc, il y a
United
déjà
Kingdom
un
is
certain
not
nombre
in the Schengen
de
space,
capacités différentes de
therefore
l'Europe,
has
mais ça ne la dispense
different
pas. D'ailleurs, le Premier ministre
capacities
Cameron l'a
from the
dit,
rest of Europe, but that does
d'un
not
effort aussi de
mean
solidarité.
it should not
Et d'ailleurs,
take
c'est
part
le
in
sens
the
des
solidarity
actions que nous
movement,
menons
as
entre les
Prime
deux
Minister Cameron
gouvernements
has just
pour régler
stated.
autant
And
qu'il est possible
our
la
two
question de
governments
Calais.
are talking
Car
about the
à Calais,
Calais
ce sont des
issue,
personnes
because in
qui viennent
Calais
non
we
pas
have
pour avoir
people
l'asile en France, mais
who
pour
don't
aller
want
au
to
Royaume-Uni.
have political asylum in France,
Chacun
but
doit
want to go
comprendre.
to the United
On ne peut
Kingdom.
pas demander une solidarité
Everybody needs to
lorsqu'il
understand
y a un problème
that you can't
et
ask
s'exonérer
for
de ses devoirs
solidarity
quand il y a des
faced
solutions.
with one problem, but refuse that in other situations. The climate change conference will be held in 3 months in Paris. The objective of that conference is to cap climate change at 2 degrees Celsius. Do you believe such an objective is still attainable? And if this is not agreed upon, do you believe that the conference will be deemed a failure? There is a risk there. Admittedly, anyone who believed this would be a stroll through a rose garden leading to Paris, with laurels already being prepared, agreements that had already been signed, and suddenly the world's climate was going to change. I'll have to disappoint them. That's not what's going to happen. And in fact, there are risks that the conference might be a failure. It's true. We've only received about 60 contributions. Statements are at times stunning, but not always backed by funding. And it's respect to the issue of funding that everything will be depending upon. Along with my foreign minister, we are working on that issue, because that's the key. Of course, we need to have binding agreements. We need to look at everything that could mobilize all economic players, major non-governmental organizations. Agreed. But there will be no agreement if emerging countries, southern countries, will refuse, and it's understandable if there's no firm commitment to funding. What are they asking for? This funding to be measurable and is to be reviewed over time. And that's what we're working upon right now. We need to meet an objective of $100 billion in 2020. That was the same figure as in Copenhagen, and we've not taken inflation into account. Okay, there is no inflation right now, but nonetheless, why would some countries believe that we could reach that objective, although we've not achieved any progress since Copenhagen? So barely 3 months ago, barely 3 months from the conference, one issue is obviously going to be crucial, i.e. funding. And France is going to launch an offensive at the highest level at the United Nations General Assembly, continue in Lima, when a conference will be held there in October. Lima in Peru, that country organised the climate change conference last time, and then we'll have to reach a pre-agreement. There needs to be a pre-agreement on this issue of funding, so the heads of state and government can come to Paris certain that we're going to reach a conclusion. And if we don't reach a conclusion, I've mentioned the issue of refugees, but if we don't reach an agreement, if no measure, substantial measures agreed upon to ensure this transition, we won't have hundreds of thousands of refugees in the next 20 or 30 years we'll have to deal with. We're talking about millions of them. The shipwrecks of climate change, people fleeing desert zones, countries that are going to be flooded, as is the case for several islands, cities that will no longer be able to be built. We'll have a string of disasters. I'm not trying to be gloomy, but this is the situation we face. And France will be organising this conference, and I will do everything I can to ensure we can reach an agreement on climate in December. And France will have to give an example in terms of funding. That's why we launch a major reform of our development policy.